A very good afternoon to everyone on this very special session of D-Talks or Disruptive Literacy Talks. Good morning to everyone who is joining us from the western part of the world. I am Mashood Bhatt, your host for today's session. In the series of these talks, we have focused on ideas, disruptive solutions, how all ideas which can help us really move forward from the major disruption which the pandemic has caused and continue our journey towards fulfilling the SDG 4 goals with special focus on foundational literacy and numeracy. And when we talk about disruption, when we talk about things working on a scale, technology and ICT becomes a crucial vehicle, a crucial fulcrum which can determine the success of any initiative when it comes to education and learning. And to speak on how technology and how what the role of digital learning and technology will be in this process of recovery from the COVID, and how education and learning can be ensured and equitable access can be ensured with the help of digital technologies post-COVID. We have a very special guest. He is the UNESCO Chair in ICT for Development. He is an emeritus professor of geography at Royal Holloway in the University of London. And a very widely accomplished and published author. More recently, he has also published a book by the Oxford University Press, which is titled "Reclaiming Information and Communication Technologies for Development" as well. It is an absolute honor for us to welcome Professor Tim Unwin to speak on today's D-Talks. Tim, an absolute honor. Thank you so much for your time and joining us today.
Thank you very much. If you could put the slides up, we can get underway. But while doing that, I just perhaps, if we go back to the beginning, share with those on who are listening in and watching. Normally when one talks about disruption, one thinks about bright young people coming in and disrupting the past. But in our conversation earlier, can you move the slides to the top, Mashood? I can only, we need to go to the first slide.
Oh.
So while we're doing that, Mashood and the team at Global Dream, we were talking about, in some ways, actually, it's only people who get as old as I do who've had, more than 60 years of experience and have been in different learning environments, who can actually reflect on that and be really disruptive, because many younger people are sort of constrained within the systems in which they're working. So I hope, from a semi-retired old white man from England, what I have to say, and I'll focus in on the Indian context, you'll see why as well. I hope it may be a contribution to these fascinating disruptive talks that Global Dream are organizing. So thanks, Mashood, and thanks to the team, Sunita, for welcoming and asking me to do this. Those alert today, this afternoon, and it's good to have you here. We'll perhaps reflect on where the picture in that slide is. It's in a part of India once known as South Bihar, now Jharkhand. And it was taken more than 45 years ago when I first started working in India. So it's always a huge pleasure to come back to some of my intellectual roots. And the one thing I really learned all those years ago was that development is about reducing inequalities rather than maximizing economic growth. And I think we're living in a world where everything is about the individual, it's about economic growth, and we've lost much of the importance of community, equality and equity. And that's really what I would like to share some thoughts with you over the next 20 minutes. If we could have the next slide, please. So there are sort of three themes running what I'd like to say, and they link very, very closely to the work of Global Dream in achieving literacy for all. And really the three themes, and I'll come back to them at the end, and I hope you can see through the talk how they come to fruition. The first is that learning has to be about being human and communal. It's not necessarily just about individual success. And in that context, there are two initiatives that if you're unaware of, I would strongly encourage you to explore. One is, of course, the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, which is doing a whole program at the moment around empathy and kindness in learning. And another is something that a group of young people in the UK have set up called Empathy Week. And if you just, it's empathyweek.com, the URL there. These are really important in learning effectively. And you know, communal learning to help everyone in a community gain literacy, for example. You know, the older people who are illiterate and in all sorts of different ways, but who can't use digital technologies, for example. Well, we can set up communal initiatives where younger people can help them to gain that. The second theme is a respect for diversity and difference of opinions. We're living in a world where there's huge emphasis on universals and everything being the same. And one of the lessons I've certainly learned over the last 45 years in education and digital has been that you can't implement universal solutions. And we're just talking again with Global Dream, you know, they have their training programs in 13 different languages, which is great. That's a dimension of diversity. But what works well in India may not work well in Rwanda, for example. So we have to have respect for diversity, difference of opinions, and particularly encouraging critical thinking. So disruptive talks are all about critical thinking. And I hope I'm not going to be too critical in what I have to say and follows. And the third issue, really building from that first slide I shared, is the importance of equality and equity. This is quite simply about those with least need most support. And I'm hugely critical, for example, of the SDGs, because they're almost all about achieving economic growth. Only SDG 10 is about reducing inequality. But the point about equity is to ensure that the poorest and the most marginalized benefit. We have to provide extra resources to that. And it's often said, you know, connecting the last mile digitally is vastly more expensive than connecting the first mile, which is why I always turn the terminology around. We shouldn't talk about the last mile. The poorest and the most marginalized should be the first mile. And again, I don't know how many people would recognize the picture there, but of course, a school in what is now Jharkhand, and the importance of learning and gaining skills is something we're going to be talking about. So building on that, next slide, please. Educational technology, EdTech, is often seen as the solution to solving COVID in terms of learning, enabling everyone to have learning at home, in inverted commas. And people are often looking to that as the solution to solve education's problems. Now, I've been working seriously in this field for 25 years. And I used to be a champion, absolutely, of the use of technology in learning. And I think when I began, I'm a bit of a geek. I was programming in Fortran in the 70s and have always loved the digital world. I didn't see all the problems that came with that. And so that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today, because I would suggest that EdTech is actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. And that's because look at the term EdTech. Where does that place the emphasis? It places the emphasis on the technology rather than the education. And that's in part because it's driven by the powerful global EdTech sector. And I just put up a slide here that kind of captures this in the Indian context. You know, Indian EdTech sector to change the landscape and customer behavior. Well, are learners actually customers? Shouldn't we see that as being something more important? Next slide, please. And the case I want to make is, of course, that much of the focus on digital in learning is driven by private sector interests. And India is, I'm just showing these slides from India, not to say that India is any different from other parts of the world, but you can see the emphasis on education as a market. And this has been driven as much by US global corporates, as it is also by Chinese companies. So there's nothing special, particularly about India, although I think India does profile and feature this perhaps much more aggressively than others. Next slide. a moment to reflect. We tend to think of that education, private sector drive in learning in digital technologies as being the solution. But I want to put a case before you, and we can come back and talk about it in more detail in discussion afterwards, that education is actually far too important just to be left to the private sector. And these young learners in Tanzania and Africa, how do we provide an appropriate learning environment in their context, for example? And unlike in India, in the African context, we'll come back to a bit later, much of the country, much of many countries, particularly in the center of the continent, lacks any electricity. You can't deliver digital tech without having appropriate electricity there. So because of this, I've become very much an advocate of the importance of helping governments deliver better solutions that aren't driven by the private sector interests. And next slide, please. And this is really what I want to begin talking with you today. And another background, about 15 years ago, a state education minister from India, and some of you I'm sure will recognize the city, but I can't name the person, challenged me when I was being a great advocate of the value of digital tech. How do you know that the money spent on ICTs for education couldn't have been better spent on improving learning outcomes if it had been spent on something else? And that resonated with me because at the time I was feeling exactly the same thing. What we don't do, there are lots of pilot projects using digital tech where a person with a great idea comes in, pilots it with a group of children, usually in more privileged contexts, not in the most marginalized areas, and gets positive results. But how do we know if we spent that amount of money on some other kind of initiative, the outcomes in terms of learning for the poorest and the most marginalized mightn't be better? Those experiments aren't done. Let's say we're going to spend, I don't know, using my currency, pounds, £100,000 on a project. And it's easy to show good results. But what if we were to use that money to do something else? Nobody ever would double the budget to do those kinds of research and practice experiments. They're what we need if we're going to make a difference. So we've tried to pull together evidence from all over the world. Next slide. And produce a solution that's important for governments. And I just want to make sort of three kind of provocative comments at the beginning. I believe passionately in the importance of government in delivering free and universal education, but they need to do it in collaboration with the private sector, civil society, and governments. Why do I believe that governments are important? Because the private sector cannot deliver effective learning for all, neither can civil society. It's only governments amongst the tri-sector model of the world in which we live, the private sector, civil society, and governments. It's only governments who theoretically have the responsibility to deliver effective education. And I'm a strong advocate of rolling back the neoliberal hegemony, which means that which has argued over the last 40, 50 years that the private sector should take over much of the government's role because it can do it more efficiently. And for this to happen, we need long-term learning vision in countries across the political spectrum. Next slide. Obviously, people tend to come back to me and say, well, Tim, what do you do when you don't trust governments? And I do have an answer to that, but probably it takes a long time to explain, so I will leave that to the end. So because of that, last year during COVID, we set up an initiative on how digital tech can be used to support education for the most marginalized. Fortunately, this was funded by the UK government and the World Bank. And I want to share with you now, in the last sort of 6 or 7 minutes of what I want to say, some of the findings of that as a way forward. Next slide. And basically, we began by saying everyone's thinking of COVID as a problem. Well, let's think of it instead of in a more positive way. Let's see this as an opportunity to reboot education systems. We can learn from COVID, we can learn from lots of the experiences before, but let's use this as an opportunity to encourage governments to do things differently in a post-COVID world, so that COVID is an opportunity of change, not just a threat. And fundamentally, we wanted to come up with a simple set of guidance for governments on how they can use digital technology in resilient education systems that will benefit the poorest and the most marginalized, not just the rich and the powerful. We adopted a very consultative methodology. We drew on experiences of existing good practices. We placed quite a bit of emphasis on follow-up action. Far too many global reports just remain as unread PDF files, not even on shelves anymore. You can probably see my bookcases behind me here. I still love books, as Mashoud said at the beginning with my latest book on reclaiming ICT for D. So I want to share the basic results of that and hope that they will be markers. You'll pick up something that can change what you do in your own practices. Although it's written for governments, it's obviously relevant for all. Next slide, please. And to understand where we're coming from, we need to understand the way, I've used the word marginalized a lot, but very much thinking about marginalization as a process. A question we can begin with: why don't the poorest people in the world have access to the best education? That's not a trivial question to answer. But in answering, we have to think, well, actually, there's a process that means that that is what happens. Marginalization is about how people are often unconsciously, but sometimes deliberately excluded from access to resources and opportunities. So why do people with disabilities, for example, generally have less good educational facilities? Why do women in some patriarchal societies, why do certain ethnic groups not have access? Why do people in particular locations, geography comes into that, isolated areas? And our interest is in how digital technologies can be used positively rather than just negatively, because it's absolutely true that digital tech increases the potential for inequality and marginalization. If you think, your latest smartphone or your old Nokia from 15 years ago, what you can do with those in a 2G or a 5G environment are completely different. But the focus is on the latest smartphone, for example, rather than solutions that will help the poorest and the most marginalized. And that's where we were focusing, because unless we do that, we do not achieve equity in education. Next slide, please. So, report was produced in 3 acts. We used the word act because it must be performed on the world stage or on the local stage. So an executive summary, a full report, and then a unique feature was a set of guidance notes, and I'll give you an example of those later. Next slide, please. And we tried to learn from past mistakes. It was a very participatory process. We consulted and worked with 43 women and 44 men, pretty good gender equality, not quite the right way around, but pretty good. People from 34 countries, from small island states to large countries, from the private sector to civil society. And an interesting thing about the report is that it's in multiple languages. Not quite the full 13 of India, but at least we did our best. And there are even audio, so you can listen to it while being driven in a car or going for a walk. And we also didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so we did our best, not as successfully perhaps as we might have done, but engaging with other global initiatives. Next slide, please. And this captures the report, and I'm not going to go through it in huge detail, but I'm going to just pick up little things. If you note the blue at the top, the holistic vision, and the financing at the bottom, those both have to be in place. There has to be a commitment from governments, and then the 5 areas in the middle that I will now go into in some depth. So next slide, please. So before one can make any progress in terms of governments using digital technology effectively to support learning amongst the most marginalized, 2 things need to be in place. Firstly, a holistic vision and a commitment to equity. And if governments had that already, this would happen. And something that became very clear in our work was that unless the government has that vision, there's actually little point in working with them to develop a solution that will benefit the most marginalized. I would probably provocatively, disruptively go as far as saying it's not even worth wasting our energy on that, because unless a government has that commitment, education will always continue to serve the rich and powerful. And also, the implication of equity is that governments must be willing to put appropriate financing in place to enable these changes to happen. But on financing, a really interesting feature of our report is that actually to achieve effective digital tech in learning isn't necessarily very expensive. And what makes it expensive is the drive and the thirst of the private sector wanting to profit from it. It's possible to do a huge amount relatively cheaply. And the next slide shows the 5 areas where action is necessary for governments. Firstly, a whole society approach delivering equity. This involves community organizations. It involves the private sector appropriately. It involves the elderly and the young learning from each other. Secondly, one has to have appropriate infrastructure in place first. And above all, it's got to have electricity and it's got to have connectivity. But connectivity to the first mile, not what's usually called the last mile, connectivity to the most marginalized. and compared with many countries in the world, India is actually quite good on this, certainly in terms of rural electrification. But much more needs to be done to enable digital tech to be affordable and accessible to everybody in the country. Thirdly, everything going back to the point I made earlier about diversity, we have to have context-specific technologies and content. Do we really want US content to be shared globally in the form in which it was originally developed? That purely serves US neo-imperialism. We need to develop local context, learning content, and relevant technologies. For example, one of the learnings from COVID is a huge amount of learning can be achieved effectively through traditional technologies, which are accessible almost universally, such as radio and television. The role that they can play in learning is hugely important. So make content and make technology specific to the context in which you're working. There are 2 of the colleagues in Global Dream that we're talking with earlier today. And one is working in Kashmir, another in Bhopal. Well, the solutions for those 2 areas are going to be very different. Fourthly, we have to have appropriate pedagogies for teaching and learning. One of the sad things about COVID in some parts of the world, a lot of people have access and use WhatsApp. But there were cases where teachers were trying to use WhatsApp to teach in the way they used to teach on a blackboard. This is crazy. And I believe passionately that we have to begin with teachers and learning facilitators, enabling them to understand how technology can be used effectively. And this isn't just teaching them, for example, Microsoft Office technologies. And then finally, technology has to be used wisely. And that's a catch-all, but to remind us to focus on security, privacy, and data protection. A lot of my work is on the dark side of the use of digital technologies, around their use for violence against women, for child abuse. And this is an area that we have to get right. To enable the positives of digital technology, we have to mitigate the harms, and those harms are very real. Let's never forget that. Next slide, please, as I draw towards an end. And another feature of our report was that we had 14 guidance notes. I don't expect you to read all of that, but this is just an example of one on disabilities. The report has a set of almost a checklist of things. If you get them right, it's going to help you ensure that digital tech are useful for learning more broadly. And I can say more about those in discussion afterwards. Next slide, please. So, some concluding reflections. And the background is, as I'm sure many of you would recognize, a scene from New Delhi. And I hope that my reflections have been a little bit disruptive. They've been a little bit challenging to you. But going back to emphasize that learning must never just be technical. We need to have the communal notions of empathy, responsibility, that care for each other. That education is, to use the MGIEP's term, also about kindness. if we think about helping people to learn effectively and appropriately to gain literacy, as Global Dream is seeking to achieve, that is an act of kindness. Secondly, we have to encourage critical thinking and value diversity. Going back to that point about local context, content and technologies, but not having a learning system that is just imposing one particular view of the world. And I think digital technologies have come dangerously close to being used to have a single accepted truth, what is politically correct. We must allow challenges of opinion to any attempt to create a universal learning rhetoric. And finally, governments, come on, it's your responsibility to ensure equity in education systems. And we as the people have to hold our governments to account. So thank you for inviting me to share. I went a little bit over my 20 minutes. I do apologize. But the final slide is from one of my favorite Indian cartoonists. I hope you recognize the work of Alok. And you can see here a running track, the Olympics perhaps, and it's the running track of online education, and a young rich kid with his mobile phone giving him a wireless signal to enable him to use his laptop. And then his poor cousin held back by poverty, who can't even get across the starting line. That is why we need to call this man at the back the first person in our priorities. We need to disrupt the present system to empower the poorest and the most marginalized to be able to use digital technologies to support their effective learning. So thank you, Mashood. Thank you, Sunita. I hope that was what you were expecting. I hope I wasn't too disruptive, but if I was a bit disruptive, it was done diplomatically and in a nice way. And going back to my very first slide, India has taught me so much. I hope that sharing some of my experiences may also help my friends in your fantastic country. So thank you.
Professor Tim Unwin, I think this was a very thought-provoking presentation. It has clearly disrupted a lot of and ruffled a lot of feathers, and I think the striking beauty and also pain of the image that you've shown at the last, right? You talked about that we always talk about delivery at the last mile, but it's like someone who's trying to run a mile, but his legs are shackled. So it's a very striking image. Thank you so much for sharing these really thought-provoking ideas as well. You've covered some very very interesting areas. I mean, especially technology. You did mention that there's a huge boom, especially in edtech. India. You mentioned those millions of dollars of investment which is happening in edtech as well. One question which we had was regarding, you talked about education needs to be primarily the responsibility of the government because education is a public good. But what we see is infrastructure, especially digital infrastructure, comes a lot from private investment. And as here in India, we know that all the internet and the access to smartphones, etc., everything is because of private investment of big corporates. My question was that, do you see that this private investment trying to deliver a public good like education is a problem? And what is your assessment in other countries, other middle and low income countries? Is this a problem there as well, where private investment in digital infrastructure causes a problem for delivery of a public good?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we could spend an hour talking about it. So let me simplify at the beginning. I think this is pretty much a universal problem, and the point I think you're making is that to enable digital tech to be used for education and learning, we need to have universal access to electricity and connectivity. And how do we achieve that? And I sort of think of it like, the usual model is that people begin at the top and talk about connecting the next billion, be it to electricity or be it to digital connectivity. And the private sector will do that anyway. And they will find ways of moving down to the next billion and the next billion. But the point I'm sort of trying to make is, therefore, how do we ensure that what most people call the bottom billion, I call the first billion, because it focuses our attention. How do we deliver that? And at a kind of theoretical level, imagine if you develop a solution that enables the poorest and the most marginalized to have that connectivity, and you can afford to do it. That will undercut everybody else who's going the other way. And so you will move up through the market. And this isn't the bottom of the pyramid kind of argument. So where does the government's responsibility come in? And that is in working together with the private sector and civil society in effective partnerships. This isn't partnerships of, fundamentally driven by the interests of the private sector, but it's partnerships between the government and the private sector to and involving civil society as well. The public-private partnerships generally don't work because they don't involve the wider community. This is the first of our boxes. It's a communal solution, and it is possible to achieve those. I think another way is through the regulatory environment, and I know regulation of digital tech sector has been, for many years a challenge in India. I was privileged enough to be Secretary General of the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization, and I got to know two Indian telecom regulators very well, and I greatly enjoyed my conversations with them. But it's a real challenge in getting that right, and I think governments can put in place incentives to enable that connectivity to happen. I mean, India, you've done it with electricity. There is pretty, compared with African countries. If you look at the maps, some African countries only have 9% of their country connected to electricity. Now, imagine if that was in the case. It isn't. So you've got an advantage there. Partnerships, regulation, and the third area I think is in technological innovation. There's the debate about the use of white spaces, for example, in delivering connectivity in India. But there are, if we can develop innovative solutions, and I have to say, I think some of the work that the Chinese are doing in this area is exciting. Now, if you look at Chinese connectivity and compare it with some other parts of the world, but it's also all the emphasis is on 5G, the latest technology, moving forward. And another, as I said in passing, another solution is I think using technologies that already exist, but using them better. And radio and television. I remember. And this is meant in a very, very positive way. I remember in the 70s, sitting outside on a cool evening, well, still a very hot evening, but watching films on a sheet hung between trees. And in Bangladesh, there are examples of where boats are used to bring learning, and again using screens. There are lots of innovative ways we can use old technologies as well as creating innovative new technologies. Mashood, as you gather, I could speak for hours on this, but I hope that partly answers your question.
Right. Absolutely, Tim. And I think it's a very important point that you made, that it's important to sort the access challenge out in terms of at various levels. It has to be at the top policy regulatory levels as well, but also kind of use existing rich traditional aspects as well, traditional technologies as well, like you mentioned, transport, television, radio as well. And we've seen that there seems to be more adoption of those, leveraging those technologies as well post the COVID. Here, one more question with respect to public education is, we see, I mean, in India's context, for example, that there has been a gradual shift of children from public schools to private schools as well. And one reason has often been discussed is the perception that private schools are more accountable because you're paying the fee, whereas government schools are not. Uh, uh, is that something which you which this kind of also seems ironic because you can still elect governments, right? Like you can make them accountable through elections as well. D- what is your assessment of why such a challenge exists with respect to accountability of public schools, at least in countries like India? And do you see a similar pattern in other countries as well regarding public versus private?
I can answer this in general terms because I wouldn't want to answer it specifically in an Indian context, although I'm sure what I'm going to say does apply in an Indian context. But I don't mean this in any way to be critical of what's happening in India. I think fundamentally this comes down to ideology. You know, what is our ideological position as to education? And on the neoliberal side, there are those who says governments don't deliver it efficiency. We can deliver it much more efficiently in a market sense where people pay for it. And even in that system, the government can pay subsidies for the poorest and most marginalized to access the private education environment. And there are many people globally who argue that quite passionately. It's a view, though, that I completely cannot hold with, because I think it is disconcerting that to use a diplomatic word, to think that people can profit from what should be a global good. And that, in my experience, in most parts of the world where this happens, the poorest and the most marginalized, who are those that I'm most interested in supporting, do not benefit from the private education environment. And in a sense, the companies providing the service, if you want to call education a service, achieve more, gain more benefit than do the poorest and the most marginalized. So that comes back to the role of the government. And here, it's a difficult one. I again had the privilege to work for a while in the World Economic Forum, and one of the features was that nearly every company, everyone involved in meetings said, yeah, education is the top priority. We need, and even the big companies, we need to have a workforce that is well trained to be able to, and that is not the case globally across the world. And the education systems are totally failing. Providing the skills necessary for the workforce of the future. And yet, despite saying that, very, very few were prepared to put their money where their mouths were. And I think at the bottom line is that governments need to realize across the world that education cannot be had on the cheap. Education costs, and it costs more to educate the poorest and the most marginalized. But that investment is worth it. And if you look at national budgets and look at what they're spent on, many countries of the world spend huge amounts on armaments, for example. If just a share of that was put into education. In many instances, the Minister of Education is not somebody of the highest profile in government. Why? Because finance ministry, foreign ministry are much more prestigious. So we need to have good leaders in education, in government, and in the civil service. It needs to be funded properly. Education, there's a lovely, I'm going to get this wrong. There's a lovely statement. Good education doesn't come cheap, but try ignorance instead. Or words to that effect. I think if you'll permit me just another observation on this. It's often pointed out that one of the challenges in my argument is what do you do when you have corrupt governments? And that's partly why I said in passing, but one of the key things is you've got to have a cross-party, or if you've got a single-party state, a universal long-term strategy for education. Depoliticize education. Have a long-term strategy in place that all governments of whatever hue subsequently for 10, 15 years will follow. Only then can you get substantial change. But ultimately, a government should represent the interests of the people. There are solutions to what happens if they don't. Some of them are not very pleasant. But one of the fundamental duties of a government is to provide appropriate learning for all of its citizens. Education is too important to be left to the private sector, who will only do it in their own, well, who will primarily do it in their own interests. If a private sector company doesn't make profits, it won't be sustainable, it won't succeed. You know,
Right.
all of us should be paying our taxes to support a good education system for all, and that includes people with disabilities, women, and in many parts of the world, you know, women aren't allowed to go to school, and that doesn't cost anything to change, for example.
Right. Very powerful points, Tim. And if we talk about talking about also making public education systems work, and specifically with respect to, you know, from the perspective of using technology, we see that a lot of data around, you know, why we know that there is a learning crisis across the world is because organizations like UNESCO, World Bank, etc., have collected data and collated data also, and have created a discourse and discussion on that. The learning, there is learning poverty, and there are still a lot of children who don't have foundational literacy and numeracy. In India, we have the National Achievement Survey and ASER bringing out data. So when we are talking about data of learning on learning levels of children, are they actually learning? Do you feel that technology and data in that sense has a role? In what role can it play when it comes to building accountability within school education systems in terms of learning?
That's a difficult one, and I'm in a disruptive talk, so I'm going to reply a little bit disruptively. Data is often, I think the key thing in what you said was, how can data be used to ensure accountability? That is a good argument. But this disruptive, provocative, this fetishization of data primarily serves the interests of the organizations gathering the data and the companies and individuals involved. So with the SDGs, there is a whole industry out there in producing data to show whether or not the SDGs are going to succeed. But the SDGs have failed already. So, you know, that is driving that agenda. A second point I'd make is data is always created for a purpose. How many of the poorest and the most marginalized actually are involved in creating that data, have access to that data, use it to their own interests? Almost none. Almost none. So it's other organizations who are benefiting from it in the claimed interests of the poorest and the most marginalized. So I particularly around, for example, this applies most specifically in the realm of data analytics. Who benefits from data analytics? It's the big companies and organizations and groups who have the power to actually understand data in the first place and understand how it could be manipulated. Until the poorest and the most marginalized can actually be involved in that data analytics realm, they're not going to be empowered by it. And I think that is a very powerful argument. And you know, if you look at the imbalances there, imbalances between the big data companies and isolated, you know, tribal groups in Odisha. Sorry, I'm old-minded. You know, how are they going to use that data to serve their interests? Now, and we must remember, data doesn't exist. All data is created for a purpose. So I've moved a little. But it's a disruptive talk. I'm just. I mean, I think I could could argue the case, yes, we do have to have data, of course we do, holding governments accountable. But who is holding the governments accountable? And civil society organizations, yes, and in this tripartite world of government, private sector, civil society, that is a key role of civil society. But I think I would also say that it's about, that's not going to change the work of going back to Jarkhan. That's not going to change the lives of poor farmers in Tribasa district or whatever, hunter-gatherers or gatherers who are collecting lac to sell in the markets, for example. We need to have organizations like your own who are actually grounded, doing a little bit at a time. Maybe from my own religious background, as well as talking the big picture, we have this idea that actually every single person you help on the journey is a value. So one can have the big meta narratives, but it's also there's this point about empathy and kindness at the individual level, and changing. You can change the world one grain of sand at a time.
Right.
It might just take a long time.
Right.
Sorry, that's a bit of a random, mixed up answer, but I hope it has challenged me.
Right. The point I think which is also striking is that the usefulness of data when it comes to actually empowering the learners, it really depends on who is able to understand that data and use it, right? So, for example, if we have data of a village and we see that in the 50 schools that are there and there are 100 children in that, is the community able to access that data of how their children are learning and then use that?
Mashoud, you use the word we. Who are we? The children and the families know whether or not their kids are going to school and are being educated, or there's a teacher in the classroom. They know that already. They don't have to have external consultants going in, doing big surveys and analysis being published in UNESCO reports. They know already. So that's not the issue. The issue is how that knowledge can be used actually to change the learning of their grandparents and their newborn children, and which comes back to communities. The communal solution, not the individual solution, matters. I'm a great believer, and in India, the Panchayati Raj system and all there are lots of how can we use these to make changes rather than waiting for a big global report? Anyway, most big global reports, the data is X years out of date by the time it's published, and an awful lot of it is wrong.
Right. That's a very important point that you make. That and it's clearly something which should trigger a lot of thoughts and rethinking on organizations' approach towards data when they're working in education. Here, I would like to take the conversation also to what you talked about, having appropriate pedagogies and a community-centric approach, an approach which really enables not just the learner to kind of redefine the relation with the community, but also empowers the whole community as such. In the current context, post-COVID, we see that for the foreseeable future, learning seems to be like a mix of synchronous, asynchronous learning. Some of it is happening inside the school, some happening online, WhatsApp, and some in the community, right? And we are with uncertainty, especially in countries like India regarding COVID. This seems to be continuing. Do you see that? What role do you see technology playing as an opportunity? Because you mentioned that it's an opportunity as well as a problem. What opportunities, in fact, would you say, and challenges we face with respect to technology, using technology in this kind of a setting? And what would be those appropriate pedagogies, in your opinion, that our teachers and community members need to be to undertake?
Huge question again. Thank you. I think the term that's increasingly being used is hybrid education systems. That the future is going to be kind of a hybridization of education. That means that we need to be, what's been said actually for a long time, digital tech enables learning to take place anywhere, anytime. Now, how can we maximize the benefit of that? And I think in the medium term, this isn't going to happen overnight. You know, we are going to move to systems where that are much more fluid, and that also combine lifelong and life-wide learning, to use UNESCO terminology, in the sense that we don't see education as something that, and to use sort of US terminology, K through 12. It's a comprehensive, holistic learning environment for people throughout their lives. If we begin with that and say, okay, in some places you're going to be learning while you're in the, you will learn from your parents and grandparents how to plant rice in the field. That's learning. You don't have, you're probably learning much better than if you tried to do it in the classroom. That other times you need to learn a particular set of specific skills to get a job. We haven't touched on assessment, which is another huge area that needs revision. How do you, what is in the curriculum, by and large at the moment in the sort of school system, determines what people learn, on how it's assessed. The teachers teach to the assessment, and particular in let's say a country like India, but also China, where the huge numbers and getting the highest marks are absolutely essential for your future success. And in a hugely competitive world, you've got to be a topper in India to be successful and move on. Immensely difficult to kind of deconstruct that. That is likely to remain for a long while. But I think that this is why it's important to have universal connectivity and access to appropriate technologies, and so that people can learn. I think learning is another two other big lessons we've learned from COVID. One is parents are often not very good teachers, and the other, there is an important social dimension to learning. So coming together collectively in some environment, that environment can be under a tree, it can be in a schoolroom, it can be in a family home. How we enable that is important. So hybridization, digital is an important part of that. But my interest is how we can ensure that digital, everybody has access. So it's communal solutions. I mean, that there are, programs in India to get digital connectivity. Yeah, certainly into each major, or each small village, let's say. But how do you get it out from there to people's homes? So and what devices do we have to use? One tablet per child solution or one laptop per child solution. These are not the way forward. But maybe. I actually don't know any initiatives that are doing this. There probably are some in the world, but it is possible to get connectivity anywhere if you're willing to pay for it. And there's satellite solutions for some of the most isolated areas. But that could be paid for, and you could, and every community could have a central hub that can be used for learning, for health, for provision of government services, and then actually, what's the solution that works best in that environment? It may not be a fixed school, but this socialization of learning, this communal, and the physicality of it, the smells, the tastes, the touches. They're throwing a ball to each other. We can't yet do that virtually. There are many things we can't do virtually. This comes back, I think, to the point I was making about empathy. So just some thoughts. But the hybridization is where the future is going to be. That needs to be, how that looks will vary in different contexts. The short
thank you, Tim, for really helping us really stretch our imagination about what that hybrid future looks like, at least for the foreseeable future. Here, we would also like to invite another disruptive personality who is the convener here at Detox, Dr. Sunita Gandhi. Dr. Gandhi, Professor Tim has really been disrupting the scene for the past 1 hour with his thoughts and ideas. Any questions or any thoughts that you have on this very important issue?
Well, yes, I've been listening very intently, and I think you're challenging us to think in a very, very different way, in the right way, actually. Finland, for example, has emphasized equity and inclusivity, and I think they've done so brilliantly as a result. The Netherlands has, you talk about financial, combining that with the finances. Where do you put your money? And what Netherlands seems to have done, and you must be knowing, of course, as well, that they are putting more money with the children who are underprivileged, and they're coming from the ghettos and the inner cities. So they can go to any top elite school and carry more money than an average child to that same school from the government. And they also get paid for their transport to that school across the city. So I think this is something really remarkable what's going on in some of the countries, and we can learn from. What's really hot off the plate right now is China unveiling that it's going to overhaul its 100 billion education ed tech sector. And they'll be banning companies that teach the school curriculum from making profits, raising capital, or going public. Now that means a whole bunch of companies have come down on their knees already. Those that were, getting money from various, funding agencies like TAL Education Group, the New Oriental Education and Technology Group, the Gaio2 Tech Edu Inc. They lost 98% share just yesterday. So all the people who have funded them, like Tiger Group Management, Temasek Holdings PTE, and SoftBank Group Corp, they'll have to find other clients. They've lost big time money. And this is just overnight, they declared. What is really interesting is that it is a backlash against the industry, as excessive tutoring torments youth, they say, burdens parents with expensive fees, and exacerbates inequalities in society. So this is their way of handling the inequality issue. I think it's just fascinating what's going on. They're saying that education industry has been hijacked by capital. So I think, it's kind of echoing with your thought and sentiment right here on Disruptive Talks. And this is definitely very disruptive, what's happening. Why are the other countries not earning? Your idea of the kibbutz of ed tech, the idea of community ed tech is also very powerful. But, why does it not get traction? That's one of my questions to you. Some countries are doing it, and pretty well so. But why not all?
Yeah, thank you ever so much. I mean, I was looking around for my copy of this. I don't know if you've read Xi Jinping's Governance of China. It's 3 thick volumes. But I think what's happening...
I have not read it. That I can definitely...
But what I think for anyone who's interested in China, it's essential reading. It's very, very difficult. It's quite repetitive. But China has over the last 5 years been going through a fundamental restructuring. And I think what we're seeing, you've just cited examples of in the ed tech sector, is part of I don't think we should see that in isolation. It's part of a bigger reining in, if you like, of a whole range of different interests, not least the tech sector. And if you see what's happened to Alipay and things like that as well, purportedly in the interests of society as a whole. I mean, one of the points that the Chinese leadership makes very much is that the benefits, that China is still a lower middle income country. We need to ensure the benefits are spread to everybody, and that's part of what's underlying this. I think you use the examples of Finland and the Netherlands. I didn't say enough in what I said, Mashood and Sunita, about the role of teachers and facilitators. I think that is absolutely central. I mean, Finland has for long, it may be changing them, but the most prestigious job in Finland is a teacher. Now, no other country in the world is that the case. My son and daughter-in-law are teachers, and life is pretty tough. And we're in a privileged country and position. So, I mean, I know there are some countries in the world I know where modern schools have been built, and the local landlord uses them as cattle buyers. And when the young female teacher comes to try and teach the school, she is forced to clean the stable school out in the morning before teaching, and she's threatened with rape and violence. That's the reality in many parts of the world, well, some anyway. We have to change the social attitudes towards teachers and the whole of education. We can't just do it by sort of government diktat. So going to the first part of your question, I think this is not going to be a quick solution. We need to work at a whole deep societal level to value education for all rather than just individual success. And this is going really back to ideology at the beginning. Imagine a world where actually everybody in that society believed that everybody in the society should have equal access to the highest quality learning. That's what's happening in the Netherlands. It's possible to do. I mean, a country the size of India, that would be phenomenally expensive. But again, digital tech used appropriately can help in that solution. What one could develop curriculum resources that a facilitator rather than a high-trained teacher can help share in some contexts. But learning isn't just about acquiring acceptable knowledge or knowledge that society deems to be important. It's having that critical awareness, the ability to challenge ideas, the ability to move knowledge forward. It's all those other things as well. There's a danger that digital is just used to reinforce, learn and regurgitate type systems. I think far too often that's it. But that's driven by the assessments. But the answer to your question is it's a long-term social change that we need to happen, where empathy comes in here again. We care for each other. It's not about me, it's about we. And I will be better if my poorest neighbor is able to lead a fulfilled life. That actually is good for me. And we don't have that global attitude.
Right. Well, I mean, that the perennial issue, how do we create the global attitude? Because actually there is also the issue of inequality, like in Russian context, we can see how that leads to, revolutions on the street, and it's not healthy. It's going to have a backlash for us also. So, I mean, from a very pragmatic point of view, we need to also think of equity. But that from a social point of view, it's absolutely necessary. And from an economic point of view, let's say for the government, for the exchequer, it's also very, very powerful. So I think everything added together, it makes a lot of sense to go for equity. But why does it not happen? Like, it's not that, say in the UK, because everybody has decent home practically, and that they have somewhat of an income they can support themselves with. And there's no such thing as really utterly poor. While the utterly poor exists in, dichotomies exist in India and so many countries, where you have the extremely rich and the extremely poor. And the worry for the rich is that we won't get the support staff, we will not get the people who will help us anymore. And they want to keep them where they are. In a way, there's a psychological barrier to providing equity in the minds of a lot of people. And, if you look at the countries that they don't have such dichotomies, they still are doing really well. And everybody gets the help they need because somebody or the other will provide it. Maybe not as as much as we tend to think we need. But yes, I mean, I lived in the UK, clean my own dishes and stuff like that. But you got the washing machine. So
my washing machine is just broken, so for the last 10 days I've been washing up by hand again. Anyway, but I mean, you touch on very challenging issues, and I think social violence is something that we shouldn't just sweep under the carpet. And we look at, let's take the example of the Arab Spring, where a little bit of how digital technologies were used in part to fuel a wider set of issues, and I do not believe in bloodshed, and so a challenge is how do we change societies where powerful people don't want them to change, and that is a real challenge. I think paradoxically, at one level, digital technologies may come to the help there, that the rich will be able to afford robots to enable all their previous domestic chores to be done. Perhaps more cheaply and with less hassle than employing people to do their washing up and whatever. I think we're seeing this is a much bigger issue, but we're going to see a world where humans as producers, their role is going to get less, and humans as consumers, the role will get more. But that's I think that's a peripheral part of your fundamental question. It is partly the role of civil society to hold governments to account, and the press and the media. I mean, I do believe in the power of the press as well. What are the things that change? What we're talking about, we've had since the 1970s, particularly the 80s, we've had the power of neoliberalism. We've had the agendas of the world driven by US neo-imperialism, which is about individual rights. And again, Sunita, this is saying much bigger, but I've argued a lot over the last decade, we need to shift from a rights-based approach to a responsibilities-based approach. It's all very well saying you have a right to a free education, but if you don't say who is going to be responsible for delivering that, you have a problem. Everything has been based around rights rather than responsibilities. It is the responsibility of governments to provide good, effective education for all of their citizens. Full stop. It's our responsibility, is abilities to, so it's our responsibility as individuals to help achieve that in any context where we are.
Yeah, agreed. And so it's actually more a governance issue also, because our responsibility is like, having those CFC refrigerators and choosing not to pay for the extra amount, or choosing to pay. Both are, training the individual. But obviously it's, governance. Through governance, you ensure that nobody produces anything but CFC, safe refrigerators. So maybe that's the way to go forward, because like China has done, put a big handle on it. Of course, it's going to affect their own certain revenues and such, but they're taking a bold step in favor of equity, and I think that's pretty amazing.
But it's equity in the hands of the party, and in the hands of a powerful elite. I've had the privilege of spending quite a lot of time in China, and I teach. Just this year again online, I was doing some teaching for the Graduate School of Education in Peking University, Beida, and fascinating. And I love China, but read Xi Jinping's Governance of China, because that is, if you can't understand modern China unless you do so. But it is, and it all works providing the party and the leadership of any government does serve the interests of all of the people. And so I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Over to Mashood there as the host.
On that note, I think this would be the best time to actually take a pause and reflect on the plethora of triggering ideas and perspectives which Professor Tim Unwin has shared in this detox, and it's really been this discussion has really helped us to zoom out also from foundational literacy and look at all the other things which do impact learning even at the foundational level. And we are very grateful to Professor Tim for giving his valuable time to this forum, for sharing his wonderful ideas. and also to Dr. Sunita Gandhi for sharing her perspectives and questions as well. And with this, we hope that all those who are watching live and all those who will be watching this video are also able to think on some of these questions which Tim has really pushed us and triggered us to think more about. So thank you once again to everyone who's joining us, and we'll see you in the next session of Detox. Thank you, Tim, once again.
Thank you, Mashood and Dr. Sunita. It's been wonderful to reflect on these very, very difficult issues, and I hope I did what you were wanting me to. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim.